Hi, my name is Bethany Weisman. I'm a learning strategist with the Center for Accessible Learning, and I am going to walk you through a workshop that we offer through the Student Learning Center. It's called Ace That Test Exam Prep. So in terms of what we'll cover over the course of the next hour or so, we'll focus on getting started. So these are sort of the almost like the pre-exam things that you should be taking into account. So items like what is actually on the exam, time management leading up to an exam. So having maybe a little bit of a study plan, and also just some general things to consider as you're moving towards the exam date. We'll also cover specific tips on preparing for exams based on the type of exam that it is. So we'll look at common exam formats such as multiple choice, true and false, and essay questions. If you are looking for more than what is offered in this particular workshop, we do have a couple of others workshops that are related to exam writing. So first of all, there is a test writing and dealing with test anxiety, which is almost like part 2 of this. This is dealing with the lead up to exam. And the test anxiety is more dealing with what to do in an exam situation. The Study Smart workshop, I think, is a really great general workshop that is looking at overall how to study, or just more generally how to retain information from your courses. So even if you're in a project-based course, that can be a really useful workshop to go to because it teaches you a lot about how to meaningfully remember the material longer term. And then finally, there's also a writing open book exam workshop that focuses specifically on what you should do to prepare for an exam if you have access to all of your resources. So that's sort of a different type of situation. And just because we have those different workshops, I don't want to overlap by talking a lot about how to prepare for exams. This is more about like the logistics of exam preparation. So in terms of getting started, there are a few things that you should know. First of all, you should know some basic exam details. So for example, what is the format of your final exam? You can't adequately prepare for a final exam if you don't know what's the target. You need to know what the end goal is. Are you going to be writing multiple choice? What kind of questions are you going to have? How many questions are you going to have as well? Of each type of question, perhaps. You should also be concerned about the weight of the exam. So how much is it worth in the overall scheme of your course? So for example, is it 20%? Is it 50% of your final grade? Obviously, you want to be studying a lot more for an exam if it's weighted more heavily. You want to know what content will be covered and won't be covered. So for example, are you going to be covering chapters 3 through 8, or like weeks 1 through 6 if it's a midterm? You also want to know for a final exam, is it cumulative, meaning is it everything from the beginning of the term, even if you've had a midterm in the middle that's tested the earlier material? Or is it non-cumulative, meaning is it only everything from the most recent midterm? And your professor should be able to let you know that. Also, has your professor told you to ignore any of the material? Oh, that's not important. We're not going to be covering chapter 10 on the assignment or on the exam because we covered that on the assignment. So don't worry about it. And then finally, is the exam going to be heavily weighted towards more topics? So topics that you spend more time on in class, or sometimes that can be where you have a cumulative exam and 70% of the mark on the exam is going to be based on everything since the midterm, and only 30% is going to be on everything that you've already been tested on. So knowing those details can really help you know what to focus on and how long you should be spending on certain weeks of the course or certain material. You should also know how much time you'll have to write the exam. And give some thought to how you'll budget your time. We're actually going to talk a little bit about how to budget time, I think a little bit later in this workshop. So, and the fifth point here is, what mark do you actually need to pass the course or to achieve the final mark that you want? So that's always a good idea, especially if you've struggled a little bit in the course. you might want to know, okay, well, if a pass is a 50 or a 60 and I have a, like a 55 going in, what does that mean in terms of the mark that I'll need on the final in order to get that particular credit? Same goes if you're aiming for an A, right? And you're just around that mark or a little bit lower. Sometimes you need that mark to stay on an honor roll, or you may want that mark to stay in a co-op program. So it's a good thing to know, based on what your ultimate goal is, what you need to actually achieve on the final exam in order to reach that goal. Time management really is the key. So I would say a study plan can be a really good help for you there. So typically what I do with students when we're preparing for exams, several weeks in advance of the exam, I will sit down with the student and we will write down all of the courses that they have an exam in. So you can see we have a Post-it note over in the corner here with just handwritten the names of the courses: child development, curriculum, foundations. And what we'll do based on how much each one is worth, we'll sort of ballpark how long the student should actually spend on each exam. The general rule, if you're not sure, is for every 5% an exam is worth, plan to study for at least 2 hours. So if an exam is worth 25%, you're looking at about 10 hours. How do you calculate that? You take whatever the percentage is and you divide it by that 5%. So this would be 25 divided by 5, gives you 5. And then you're going to multiply whatever you get by the 2 hours per. So 5 times 2 is going to give you about 10 hours of studying in total. So you're going to write that down. And then typically what you want to do is adjust that if needed. So say child development, you're looking at that, you're saying, okay, well, 15 hours, that's great. But you know what? That's my hardest course. There's a lot of material. Maybe I missed a week of class because I was really sick. It's my lowest mark. Maybe you want to study for that 17 hours or 20 hours instead. And, maybe you're looking at health and wellness and you're saying, well, I have an A+ in that class. And the material's pretty easy to me. I've taken a similar course in the past, so I'm only going to study for 8 hours for that. So there's a little bit of flex there. Get your baseline based on what it's worth, and then I would adjust there based on your own situation. Always remember, studying is going to take longer than you think. Okay, you can be really optimistic about it, but it does take time and effort. Exams are going to come faster than you think. Maybe they're still 2 or 3 weeks away for you, but maybe if you actually look at your calendar, you've got a couple of assignments, a group project in there. So it happens fast. The last few weeks of the semester just sort of roll by. But if you start early, it's not as bad as you think. So that really is like key message. Start early, and then you're only doing a little bit of studying at a time, and that's going to help you learn the material better and really be prepared when the exam comes along. So the next step would be to create an exam study plan. So you take that little Post-it note with the hours that you want to spend on each subject preparing, and what you're going to do is you're going to start with a template, and with that template you're going to put in the dates, and you're going to start by putting in your exam. So you can see here starting on the 22nd, and I think this is of April. It's a final exam period in April. So child development exam from 8 until 12:30. And then on the Monday, the 24th, curriculum exam from 11:30 till 4, and so on. So you're putting in all of your exams. And then what you also want to do is maybe highlight a few key dates where you've got some larger assignments. So you can see you've got a planning write-up, you've got a learning story comparative paper, you've got a profile observation, and in each case you are putting that in and highlighting it as a major date, either a deadline or an exam date. What I would recommend once you have the dates in, you start working backwards. Okay, and this seems a little counterintuitive, but I would start with this observation skills exam on the 29th. and it's late afternoon from 3 until 6. So probably what you could do is do a little bit of studying that actual day. Not a ton, you're not going to cram, but say maybe you're going to put in 2 hours studying and preparing for observation skills. And it's the last exam by a couple of days, right? Previous to that, your last exam was on the Wednesday, the 26th. So the Thursday and the Friday are also free and open for observation skills. So you can spread it out. I'm going to do 3 hours on Thursday, 3 hours on Friday. Now, working backwards, the next day is going to be Wednesday. And that was your last exam, your second last exam, health and wellness from 2 until 5. So probably earlier that day, before 2 o'clock, you have time to do a little studying. So what we did was we put in about 3 hours of health and wellness studying. And the night before, because your exam the day before ended at 5:30, we put in a couple of hours. That morning before foundations, we put in a couple of hours before foundations. So you can see how the pattern goes. You're looking at your exams, where they're placed in the day, and maybe what you would do before or after, if anything, depending on what you have the next day and sort of the layout of your exam schedule. So you work backwards, and you can see on the weekends, nothing. Maybe you have work, maybe you have other commitments that you have to take into account, but you sort of know your own schedule. Don't put too much on any one day. Even on a day that's completely free, 6 hours is like a pretty significant chunk of time to study, divided between a couple of courses with breaks in between. Don't go overboard. Don't try to study yourself for 10 or 12-hour days. Try to keep it manageable with breaks in between. And once you're out of the exam schedule in working backwards, you're going to be, so like the week of the sort of 17th through 21st, you're still in classes that week, right? So absolutely, you're going to put study time in because exams are right around the corner, but you're going to have to be strategic about that, right? And think about, do I have class that day? Do I have other due dates that day that I have to take into account? And you can sort of see like the days leading up. So on the Saturday is the child development. So both the Thursday and Friday, there are some hours for child development. And as you work backwards, you probably want to start to calculate how many hours do I have so far for child development, for curriculum, and you're just going to keep working backwards until you've got all those hours accounted for. And if you run out of days, if all of a sudden you're like, oh, I'm at today and I still haven't put in all of my hours, what you're going to do is you're going to have to start looking at like, okay, well, Sunday the 23rd, I did 6 hours. Maybe I can do an hour more. Or maybe, Monday the 17th, I was giving myself a bit of a breather, a night off. Maybe I am going to have to study that night just to try to get my hours in. And you are going to have to change the schedule. It's not going to be perfect, but giving yourself a little buffer room here and there where you can move hours around, that's great. That's why you don't want to overschedule yourself. And really, a lot of people feel, pardon me, more confident when they have a plan in place, when they can say, I don't really have to make decisions because I've sat down and come up with a plan. And every day now, I know I'm going to get my hours in if I just sit down and do whatever is on the schedule for today. So I would challenge you, if it's at an appropriate time of the semester, to try to create an exam study plan. Fill in any of those upcoming tests, midterms, or exams. And then at the bottom of the page or on a Post-it, estimate how many hours you need, and then begin to fill in those study times leading up to the actual exam. So now we'll enter sort of a how-to guide for studying. We're going to talk about what to study, when to study, where to study, who can help to support your studying, how to study, just a tiny taste. Otherwise, you should go to the study strategies workshop, and overall, the why you should study. It's really important just to consider what to study. Make a study checklist for each class. So consider, what materials do I have? Do I have review material or questions provided by the professor? That's a key, right? Like they are giving you guideposts and sort of hints as to what could be on the exam. Do I have class notes and PowerPoint slides? Do I have previous tests that I could look at? Textbook, notes from readings. Do I have learning objectives from each lesson? That's a great starting point. Can you look at the learning objectives and say, yeah, I can answer these learning objectives. I have learned these things. That puts you in a really good place for exams. And then what to cover. Typically, I outline major topics covered in class and then try to divide those major topics into subtopics. Why do you do this? First of all, so you know what to study, and you can plan how long to study for each item as well. So study checklist examples. There are lots of templates out there. Some of them are beautiful. You can see this lovely one. Here it's a study checklist. The person in the far left column has the topics listed. There's a column in the middle that sort of is about how confident the person is with the material, from not very confident to very confident. There's a column then for whether or not you've studied, and then your comfort level after you've studied. So that is a great way of sort of checking that you've covered everything that you need to cover, and also that you are feeling the best that you can. And I mean, like, if some of them you're still just like only somewhat comfortable, those are the items that you would actually go back and look at again. My study plans do not look as beautiful as the one on the left. I have an example of one here that I used for a psychology course several years ago. So it was a cumulative final exam. So you can see here, though, this portion of the study plan actually covers new material only. So I'd been previously tested on some of the material, and I was going to review for that material a little bit differently. But for the few weeks, I think there were, as I recall, 4 weeks since the previous test, what I wanted to do was really, really focus on what I needed to know for those last 4 weeks. So what I was going to do was I was going to read over, review, test myself on the class notes, and I was going to do that 3 times. I planned to reread the textbook, so just to sort of skim through it and make sure I wasn't missing any material. I planned to do that once because I previously already read the material. This particular class had Connect questions. So the digital textbook had corresponding questions that I could go in and answer the questions, and they would sort of go back into the pile. There were about like 100 or 150 questions for each chapter. And the professor actually used to take from the digital questions, right? So it was great practice. We weren't told that we needed to do it, but it was there as a side resource. So of course I was going to get practice answering questions I was going to be tested on. So I was going to do that 3 times as well. 3 times because the professor, as I said, pulled from those questions. So it was a great way for me to prepare. It was well worth the time. And then I was also going to re-listen to the lecture. Not everyone has recordings. Not everyone has time to fully re-listen to recordings. What I used to do was I'd do it while I was on my treadmill in my basement, right? So I'd actually be exercising anyway. And instead of watching Netflix for the week before my exam, I would actually just re-listen, re-watch the lecture. And that made me just feel a little bit more confident that I hadn't missed anything from lecture. And you can see it's just a checklist. I just treated it as, yep, I did that. Yep, I did that. Yep, I did that. I wasn't looking at confidence level or anything. I was keeping it very simple, just that I was going through the number of times that I had planned. When should you study? Leading up to the exam, not just the day before, the morning of. You want to space out your studying. That's the best thing you can do for your learning. Studies have shown over and over again that if you're going to study for 6 hours for something, it's better to study for 2 hours one day, 2 hours another day, 2 hours another day, and then take the exam, than it is to study 6 hours all at once the day before the exam and write the exam. So, trust me on this one. It's really important to start as early as you can. It's a lot better for your long-term retention, and people do tend to perform a lot better. It's really also important to study in chunks of time with breaks in between. So don't study for 8 hours straight or even 4 hours straight. It's too long. Your concentration is going to start to fail. You're going to be way less focused. You're not going to be absorbing the material anyway. So it's actually better to study for shorter chunks of time with breaks in between, and just to use a timer. So set a timer for, okay, I'm going to study for an hour and then take a 15-minute break, and time the break too, and then go back to your studies and continue with that. Try to schedule study times for when you're feeling alert. And this is very different for different people, right? So for some people, you might be a morning person, afternoon person, late evening person. For some people, exercising before you sit down or in between, that might be a study break for you, study for a couple hours, get some exercise, and then come back, and then you're going to have renewed focus for the next chunk of time that you're studying. Or sometimes people study best, first thing in the morning after they've woken up and had breakfast. So just sort of try to know yourself, and ideally choose times when you're going to have the best chance of remembering the material longer term. Also, when you will experience the fewest distractions. This is hard for people, right? Especially if you're a student and you live with other students. I mean, there's always somebody around who might interrupt you, or that is doing something more fun than you, and you would rather be joining them instead of studying. So try to study when maybe there aren't a lot of other people around, or if your home is really sort of busy, even if you're most comfortable there, maybe it's best to go to the library so that you can be a little bit more focused. Early mornings can be a great time. And that's great because, no one's posting on social media at 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock in the morning. And even if they were awake, they're probably not reaching out to you. So you're probably not getting texts or emails or pings on social media at that time. So just consider when it might be best for you to get work done. Overall, don't underestimate the power of sleep or eating or exercise. Learning is a very holistic thing. And what I mean by that is you can't separate your learning from the things that you need to do to keep to take care of your body. And those basic things, the sleep, the eat, the exercising, if you're not doing those things, you are not going to be learning as well as you possibly could anyway. So make sure that you take time for those things. And if you can do some prep in advance, for instance, maybe a couple weeks before the exam, you prep some really healthy food and you freeze it, right? And then you can just pop it out and have a healthy meal on the day of an exam, or when you're actually studying for exams, without having to actually prep the food at that exact time. Where should you study? Again, this is a very personal preference. So you want to find your ideal study space. For some people, that means at home. People are more comfortable at home. They're in their own space. They're not going to get as distracted. But for some people, they're totally distracted at home. And it's better for them to actually be on campus or outside of their house, because home is too comfortable and they're too likely to sort of fall into particular patterns of not getting work done, being distracted by video games, social media, other things that they might have easy access to. It's really any place that you can get into the zone and you can get focused on the work at hand. Don't underestimate studying on the road. Obviously not if you're driving, but if you're on the bus, are you able to review some notes on the bus, or look over a study checklist, create a study checklist? Maybe between classes, maybe you've got an hour or two between classes on campus that normally you kind of use as a break. Maybe leading up to exams, you start to use those a little bit more actively towards school, or even if you arrive in class 10 minutes early. What can you do? You can look over your notes, you can create some plans for yourself, so that you're better prepared when you have a longer chunk of time. Overall, just make sure that the space is free from distractions, and as much as possible, turn off your phone. Either put it on airplane mode or turn it off completely. Who could support your studying? Lots and lots of people. Sometimes people feel very alone as exams approach. So, do you study well with others? Maybe it's a good plan to have a study buddy or a study group for yourself. If you're doing this, make sure you have a plan. Don't just say, okay, well, we'll meet and we'll figure it out. What do you want to cover? How is the study session going to work? Will everybody bring their questions for an assigned chunk? And sort of give a pop quiz to other people? Are you going to teach each other? Are you going to review the PowerPoint slides or go over questions? You also need to have a system to stay on track, because very quickly studying in groups can, especially if you're with friends, you can end up studying socializing rather than studying and focusing on what's at hand. So sometimes having someone who's a bit of a timekeeper, a gatekeeper, that person can look at the time and say, well, okay, we had our 5 minutes of chatting. Now it's time to get back on track. Who's next? So you can choose the person who is a little bit more assertive or bossy and is not afraid to sort of put themselves out there as the person to keep everyone else on track. Your professors can also assist with studying. So make sure that you attend class reviews. You can use office hours leading up to get any questions answered. And if you haven't done as well as maybe you think you could on previous tests, try to get feedback. Sit down with your professor and go over that previous test and see if they're able to give you any suggestions for how you might change. Tutors and coaches are also available through the Student Learning Center. So if you can find a peer tutor who's able to review material with you, they're students who have formerly taken the class, right? So you can learn a lot from them about what to focus on and sort of what the most important items might be. Also, family members, roommates, or friends can help, even if they're not in your program. So if you come up with some study questions for yourself or there's some review questions, you can have the person quiz you on those. Even if they're just looking to see, are you getting the answers right? They don't actually have to know the material. Or sometimes people will just more casually say, can I try to explain this concept to you? And they can tell you if you're being clear or not. Does that make sense? If it doesn't make sense, maybe you need to go back and review the material a little bit more so you can explain it in a really simple way. How to study. Again, this is very bare bones. Go to the Study Smart workshop. It is excellent and it goes through so many important topics about studying. It tells you a little bit more about the why some of these are important. So no matter what kind of exam you're preparing for, the best way to study is to quiz yourself. All right. Don't just read and reread or try to memorize. Actually create some study questions, right? If you're learning about the heart and the anatomy of the heart, you could ask something like, what are the 4 chambers of the heart, right? The answer, left atria, right atrium, left ventricle, right ventricle. It's right there in your notes and you're just coming up with a question to test yourself on it. You cover up the answer, you try to repeat it back based on just the question. Studies have shown over and over again that this is the most effective way to study because it is what you have to do on the exam. You actually have to retrieve the information from your brain and get it out on the test in some way, whether it's recognizing the answer or actually writing it down. When it comes to quizzing yourself, you can do this in a couple different ways. The simplest way is in your notes, in your PowerPoint, in your textbook. Don't make cue cards because your cue cards are already there created for you, right? They're in your notes. You just have to write the corresponding study question. Then you can cover the material and try to remember it out loud. You can do it in your head. You can do it out loud. You can do it on paper. You can do it with a friend if you're looking for sort of that social element as well. And I know that's very motivating for a lot of people. You can use things like memory tools, mnemonics. So a mnemonic is a way to try to remember information that you think will be a little bit more challenging for you to remember. So for instance, things like acronyms, remembering what you need to do to treat a sprain, rest, ice, compression, elevation. If I take the first letter of each of those words, it spells rice. So I can remember that I use rice to treat a sprain, can cover up my eyes, and I can try to remember that without actually looking. You can use things like silly sentences. So remembering the carpal bones of the hand, the scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, etc. Already challenging words to try to remember. But the trigger for each one can just be remembering maybe the first letter. Well, this doesn't spell anything. SLTPTTCH. It's hard to remember things that don't spell something. So in that case, I might try to remember something like a silly sentence or an acrostic. So Sally likes to play the tiny chrome harmonica. I can remember that. It's kind of a goofy little sentence. I might even be able to get a picture of that in my head. And then again, the first letter of each of those words is going to stand for a corresponding bone, name of a bone. You can also use things like pictures to remember information. So the two bones in your lower leg are the fibula and the tibia. And well, one of them is bigger than the other. Maybe you're having trouble remembering which one is bigger than the other. Well, maybe I can remember that the fibula is thin like a flute and the tibia is thick like a tuba, right? Fibula and flute both begin with F. Tibia and tuba both begin with T, so there's the tie there. And then there's the size comparison between a flute and a tuba that can also help you sort of remember the relative sizes of the bones. Or you can use combined methods, so things like remembering tire, which you can also visualize as a tire. And those are the main muscles of the abdomen, the transversus, the internal oblique, and etc. Mental cheat sheets can be a great way to make sure that you're on track to remember material that's a little bit more challenging. So you would never use everything on a mental cheat sheet. A mental cheat sheet should just be the things that you're the most worried about forgetting. What you would do is you would prepare a mental cheat sheet and practice writing this material down. So the long form of the mental cheat sheet would actually be to write out, what is it that I'm trying to remember? I need to remember the priorities for treating an injured person. They are airway, breathing, circulation. And I'm going to remember that by ABC. Okay. Same with treating a person in shock. I'm going to remember wart. The carpal bones of the hand, we just saw that. The Sally likes to play the tiny chrome harmonica, and so on. So I'm going to come up with what maybe there are 7 or 8 things on this list that I'm really afraid of forgetting. And I'm going to write it down long form. And then over and over again, I'm going to quiz myself. I'm going to practice writing it down. ABC, wart, Sally likes to play the tiny chrome harmonica, until it's just second nature. And from that, I'm going to try to remember, okay, ABC is airway, breathing, circulation. Okay, and I'm going to quiz myself on it. You are not going to take this into the final exam because that would be cheating, right? Like, we're not going to take something into the exam. It's called a mental cheat sheet. So what you're doing is you are practicing this so that you will mentally be able to take that information into an exam. And the very, very first thing that you're going to do is you're going to write everything down. Okay, on the back of the exam, on the margin of the exam, wherever you've got a little space for yourself. And then you no longer have to be worried about forgetting it, because you've spent the time, you've invested the time in trying to remember the material. And as soon as you're in, you've written it down. And now all you have to do is refer back to it if you have a question and you start to sort of be a little bit concerned that you can't answer it. All right, we are going to talk about strategies by types of tests now. The way that you prepare for a test, it may depend on the type of test that you have. Depending on the test, you may need to focus on larger concepts or maybe very specific details, and you may need to practice, right? Because sometimes people, you know, if they had unlimited time, they could figure things out. But you do need to practice in order to be maybe faster, more comfortable with answering certain questions, especially if they include things like formulas or equations, with maybe like math problems or science problems. What we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about preparing for multiple choice, preparing for short answer and essay, open book, and also math, science, or coding questions. So multiple choice questions, there is a heavy emphasis on knowing specific details. All of the information is supplied in the exam itself. A lot of people say to me, Bethany, I love multiple choice exams. The answer is there. I just have to recognize it. Which makes it sound really easy, but it's not necessarily that easy. Regardless, you do need to know your details. What's challenging about multiple choice? Some questions, it's just simple recall, right? It's almost like, what's the definition of this? Or in this case, what is this an example of? But there are also more challenging application questions or bigger picture questions that might be harder to answer. Okay, you might need to take this piece of information and this piece of information and this piece of information and synthesize it to be able to answer. Also, I've seen some exams, I'm thinking nursing specifically, but other exams in certain programs might be similar. Maybe all of the answers are correct, and the question is asking what is the best answer. That's so hard, right? Because you have to wrap your head around evaluating the answer, not just saying, well, this is right. They're all right, but which one is the best answer in this particular situation? You may need to differentiate between very closely related concepts. That is done very purposefully. It's not meant to trick you, but it's meant to make sure that you know the difference between these two things that are really, really similar. You may also need to differentiate between correct and almost correct. Sometimes that can just be like a single word. A single word changes something from being correct to incorrect, like always or never. And multiple choice also tests your reading skills, right? So it's really important to like slow down, really make sure you're reading every word carefully and you're not missing any part of the question. In terms of preparing for multiple choice tests, it's really important to know both big concepts and also the details. So focusing on terms and definitions, those are really important because sometimes even in an application question, they're going to give you a term. And if you don't know what the definition is to that term, you're not going to be able to answer the question. Focus on any theories or laws that are true across all or almost all situations. Look for relationships between ideas and also think examples, because again, that's where you're going to see a lot of potentially application type questions, right? Knowing that you've got a term and then, okay, this would be an example of that term. So if you see examples throughout your notes, it's really good to make sure you pay attention to them because they'll often come up as well as just the plain term definition. Don't memorize the material. All right, people spend a lot of time memorizing things, memorizing word for word. Instead, make sure you understand the concepts. If you understand the general idea, you can explain them. That is more important because guess what? They might not use the same words on the test. And if you've memorized something word for word, and you're relying heavily on that, you might not even recognize that it's even talking about the same concept. So in terms of preparing for multiple choice tests, make sure that you practice. Use all available questions, textbook, online access, review questions, anything that's provided by the professor. I would suggest when you do review questions, if it's like similar to the format you might answer on the test, consider timing yourself to see how long you spend on each question. Sometimes people will use review questions to teach themselves material. And personally, I think that's kind of backwards. What you want to do is study first, then use the review to figure out what have I learned well and where are my gaps still. If you're using it to study, then at the end, you have no way to test yourself to see what you've learned and what you haven't learned. So if you treat it like a test, that can be a great way. And then you time yourself to see how long do I spend on each question or on the whole thing. And if you spend 4 hours, but you're only going to have 2 hours on the exam, you're probably spending too much time. You need to work on your speed a little bit more. Pay attention to possible distractors. They're likely actually going to be very similar on the actual test. So distractors are when a teacher will give you an option that's very similar to what the correct answer is, and you have to differentiate between the two. You have to show that you know the difference between them. Probably the distractors on the practice multiple choice tests are going to be very similar to the distractors on the actual test. So if you get some experience with them, that'll make the actual exam go a lot better for you. As I mentioned, don't try to check the material as you answer questions. Treat them like actual questions and then double check at the end. After finishing, make sure you check the answers to the questions that you got wrong. Don't be like, okay, well, I got that wrong. I'll just do it again later and I'll see if I remember the answer. Why did you get it wrong? You know, where's your gap there? Do you need to ask a question about it or get some help? And if possible, test yourself multiple times. Getting practice with the same questions, that's going to build your confidence, and it's also going to help you learn the material. If you make mistakes and then you get them right, you're going to remember that material a little bit better. Okay, moving on to the next type, short answer or essay questions. There's a heavy emphasis on concepts and ideas. So details, I mean, are still important, but probably you're going to be able to answer questions more generally in this particular case. They're going to be less concerned about every nitty-gritty detail. What's challenging about written answers? You need to be able to generate it yourself, right? Multiple choice, the answer is there, as my students pointed out, but with short answer, you have to pull it out of yourself. There also may be multiple parts, right? So sometimes a question has, you know, first do this and then do this. Sometimes it helps, it'll be A, B, C. Although sometimes people will still skip one of them accidentally. But sometimes it's built into, like, it just looks like one question, but there's actually two things you need to do. So you do have to read carefully there. And you have to organize yourself and express yourself well, right? You need to, you know, think about what's fully going to answer the question and make sure that, you know, don't make any assumptions about what the professor knows or doesn't know. You have to show them that you know the material. Nothing is obvious. It all has to be stated in order to get those marks. So in terms of preparation, study the material to understand it. Okay, so same thing as before. Make sure that you are understanding, not memorizing. Prepare to answer a variety of types of questions. You may be asked to describe, list, compare, contrast, identify, analyze, summarize. So knowing what those types of words actually means can be helpful. Like list is easy. You know, I'm just gonna write it, even bullet form. You know, here's my answer. Compare, contrast, compare, like how are they similar? Contrast, how are they different? You know, whereas things like analyze and evaluate isn't even on here, but analyze or evaluate, it's like a judgment, right? What you're going to do is you're going to assess, like, is this good? Is this bad? And so on. You want to practice for this one too. So outline any answers to review questions. Again, try to do it after you've studied so that you can do it from memory and get that retrieval practice sort of under your belts. Think about what else the professor has emphasized. Okay, what has the professor throughout the course said, this is important, or where has there been repetition in the course? Try to anticipate questions. You know, if the review questions haven't been given to you, sit down with a student and go through the material and like, oh, that looks like it could be a good question, right? And then try to practice answering it. And you can do that practicing out loud or out loud, like in your head. I do a lot of that, or on paper, right? You can actually practice just even jotting down keywords. Open book exams. During open book exams, you have to find information really quickly. So what I would typically recommend, you have access to materials typically in open book exams. Make a cheat sheet or a quick reference sheet with formulas, charts, anything that you're going to need to refer to pretty regularly. You don't want to have to be looking that up. Just have it on a reference sheet that's right there on your desk and you can just look down and find it. Try to prepare your notes with a table of contents. So basically there, what you could do is create like Post-it notes so that you can find things. They're almost like bookmarks then, and label the Post-it notes with what you're going to flip to if you flip to that particular Post-it note. You can do that in textbooks as well, and just highlight important information in a book as well, so that when you flip to the page, it's right there and you'll be able to find it quickly. With math, science, and coding questions, these are challenging to actually prepare for. What you need to do is identify the target skills to be performed. So what is it that the professor is going to ask me to do? If it's a really basic math question, or course, maybe it's, I'm going to have to add, subtract, multiply, and divide fractions. If it's more complicated, maybe you're going to have to use quadratic equations, or you're going to need to perform trigonometry, and like what kind of trigonometry will you need to do, right angled triangles, and so on. Once you've identified those target skills that will be on the exam, you need to practice those skills until you're comfortable. That's considered like fluency. Basically, you're building fluency. We think of fluency as being like with language. I'm fluent in a language. I can speak really easily and quickly. There's fluency with skills too, right? So what you need to do is practice so that you're sort of, you've got the speed and you've got the accuracy when you get into an exam situation, which is timed. Leading into that then is the building the time limits into your practice. Don't sit down and spend 6 hours answering the review questions. If the review questions are sort of supposed to mirror the test, give yourself 2 hours, and try to get through all the questions that you can within that period of time, just like you would need to do in an exam situation. And also get practice recognizing different types of questions. So what you want to do is practice using the right method, right? If I know I'm going to have to add fractions and multiply fractions and divide fractions, well, what I should do is sort of mix those up so that I'm using the correct procedure in each of those cases. Not just answering all the addition together, all the subtraction together, where you just sort of fall into a pattern of, oh, I just answer it this particular way. In the lead up to the test, make sure that you pack everything that you need the day before. So pencils, pens, calculator, watch. You don't want to be scrambling the morning of, and you definitely don't want to get there and not have it. This is a funny story. I used to keep like a little Ziploc bag with everything that I would need in it. I had highlighters in there, and I had, pencils and erasers and a little pencil sharpener. And I used to keep a watch, like a wristwatch that I didn't wear normally, but I always just, like had it ready to go for my exams. So you would not believe the number of exam rooms that don't have a clock, right? And knowing the time is always, like, for me, it reduces my anxiety because I know that I have enough time left. And I had taken the watch out to do something else, and I forgot to put it back in. I didn't double check my stuff before I went to the exam. Sure enough, no clock in the exam room. And sure, the professor, writes up the time every half an hour, but for me, that isn't enough. Like, I just want the comfort of any time I need to, I can look down and see that time. So just make sure everything that you could possibly need is just packed and ready to go, and you're going to do that the night before. For in-person exams, check the weather, especially this set of exams. Like, the spring exams are not so bad in April, but oh my goodness, the winter exams, the ones right before the holidays, you never know what the weather's going to be. And again, I had a terrible experience rushing to an exam once. And by the time you get there and you get parked or you get off the bus, you're running to the exam and you show up, you're sweaty, you're out of breath. It's a terrible feeling. So check the weather the night before and adjust for when you need to leave, and make sure that you give yourself that extra 15 minutes or half an hour just so you can get there early, not be rushed, use the washroom, fill your water bottle, and feel good going into the exam. Get a good night's sleep the night before. It is not worth staying up really late to prepare. Studies show that sleeping is an important part of consolidating your memory, and you're not alert if you haven't slept well. You're not going to be able to think your way through really challenging problems. So it's better for you to get a little bit less studying and more sleep, I would say. Make sure you eat well, preferably something healthy that's going to sit well in your stomach, something that's familiar. Don't eat something that you don't normally eat. You want to make sure that you have the energy that you need to think your way through the test. And as always, just try to arrive early and do what's best for you outside of the exam room. So for some people, that is doing a quick once over of notes. For some people, it's just chatting with a friend about nothing related to the exam. For me, I prefer to be away from other people. I don't like overhearing what people are talking about if they're talking about the exam. So know yourself and sort of know what is important. I'm realizing I'm at the end here, and I think earlier in the presentation, I might have made mention of budgeting time. That is actually, now that I'm thinking of it, part of our follow-up to this, which is test writing and test anxiety. So if you are interested in that particular skill, hopefully you'll be able to attend that particular workshop to learn a little bit more about it. So what is your take-home message? First of all, it's really important to know basic information about the exam so that you can make good decisions about studying. So know what you're getting into. Start early. That's what the exam plan is all about, right? Plan your study time leading up to the exam and try to pace it out so you're doing a little bit at a time rather than cramming all at the last minute. And make sure you quiz yourself. You want to prepare for different types of test questions. When possible, try to predict what the professor might ask and practice pulling that information out of your brain. If you have any questions at all about this particular workshop, please feel free to reach out to me. My name, again, is Bethany Wiseman. I'm a learning strategist with the Center for Accessible Learning, and I'm really glad that you could join me today to learn a little bit about preparing for exams.